Hey guys, Maverick Christian here. This episode I'm going to go over a debate I had with Candorman on the moral argument. Part 1. Setting up the argument. First, I'll do a little summary of what my argument was in the debate. Moral semantics is about how we define moral terminology. Moral obligations have an ought component to them. For example, an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it. To explain my moral semantics and what I mean by moral ought, I'll define some key terms. In philosophy, a hypothetical imperative takes the form of something like, if you want G, you ought to do A, and describes a possible action that is practically necessary to achieve some goal. An example would be when, if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, meaning something like, as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. The ought of the hypothetical imperative is called the hypothetical ought. Let's define a descriptive ought as that type of ought that is purely descriptive. A paradigm example of a descriptive ought is the hypothetical ought, which, as you may recall, is used to describe what to do to achieve some goal. In contrast, say that the prescriptive ought is that type of ought that is not a descriptive ought. It prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive. So someone saying you should not torture infants just for fun might have the prescriptive ought in mind. The standard moral semantics is such that moral oughts are prescriptive oughts. It is false that the moral ought has no properties besides purely descriptive ones. For example, an action is morally obligatory for someone only if they prescriptively ought to do it. As a warning, some non-theists have a moral semantics where moral obligations are entirely descriptive. May sound strange, but it does happen sometimes. With the moral semantics defined, here's the argument. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then nothing is morally wrong. Premise 2. Some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. It's a theorem that given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C. Here's what it looks like in math and propositional logic. To justify premise 1, I argued that morality's existence is unlikely if God does not exist. Morality is unlikely on atheism entails probably if atheism is true, then morality doesn't exist. If you're interested, I have a blog entry proving that theorem. Given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist, justifying the first premise has some interesting implications. If the atheist denies the second premise, that some things are morally wrong, the atheist at least implicitly agrees that given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist, which means the atheist is logically committed to accepting the first premise is probably true. This means that an atheist probably shouldn't deny both premises, because that's not logically tenable. Even that summation was a bit longer than I'd like, but I thought it's important to find my terms. And unfortunately, Candorman didn't always do so, but fortunately, because of the debate format where you have opening statements and back and forth dialogue, after that you can clarify terms right away. And so, one of the Candorman's objections was that he claimed that the prescriptive ought appealed to nothing. I'm like, what the heck does he mean by that? Well, it turns out that by appealing to nothing, he meant there's no explanation for why the prescriptive ought exists. I could explain to him, well, that's not quite true. There could be an explanation for why the prescriptive ought exists, and it went on from there. Another point of confusion was this bit.
You can't actually demonstrate, at least that oughtness without a standard makes any sense.
Now, it turns out that by oughtness without a standard, he was referring to the prescriptive ought. Even though that doesn't quite make literal sense, because there is a literal standard that comes with prescriptive oughtness. There's a standard for what you should and shouldn't do. Apparently, by standard, he had in mind a descriptive standard, like the goals you find in hypothetical oughts. Part 2. Denying the second premise. Candorman effectively denied this second premise, because he denied that it was even truth-apt. So what does truth-apt mean? In philosophy, a statement is truth-apt if and only if it makes a claim that's either true or false. So, for example, a statement like, the earth is flat, is truth-apt because it makes a claim that's either true or false, whereas a question like, am I handsome? Is not truth-apt because it does not make a claim that's either true or false. Now, in philosophy, the idea that moral statements are neither true nor false is called moral non-cognitivism. And, Candorman explained his position like this.
I don't think it is coherent. I don't get any information from you when you tell me that something is a prescriptive ought. I don't think it makes any more sense than saying that is, or why is car.
Even a 5-year-old can respond to that. Why is car? Because car for driving. And car go beep beep. All kidding aside, Candorman was effectively a moral non-cognitivist, but he's a little bit weird about it. Now, ordinarily, a moral non-cognitivist would be happy to say that morality doesn't exist, but Candorman was taking an unusual step to not even affirm that. So I had to reword his denial a bit. I'd say that it is not a truth-apt true statement that moral wrongness exists. That was his position, but that was a little bit awkward, so I rephrased it as, it is untrue that moral wrongness exists, where untrue was broad enough to cover statements that weren't truth-apt. Now, The idea that it's not even coherent to say that there's something morally wrong with torturing an infant just for fun is implausible, to say the least, to most people. And to me, it seems like a rather extraordinary claim that requires, well, if not extraordinary evidence, some kind of justification. But he was a bit reticent in offering that. Here's a clip.
You have to demonstrate that it's a coherent claim.
To illustrate why I think that's not intellectually appropriate to shift the burden of proof like that, imagine if I were in a debate about whether atheism is true, where the atheist is the affirmative, and atheist is arguing for atheism is true, and this happens. And those are the reasons I think atheism is true. So, what is your rebuttal? Atheism's not true because it's not even coherent. There, I'm done. What? How is it incoherent? The burden of proof is not on me to show that it's incoherent. The burden of proof is on you to show that it's coherent. Well, here I'm defining atheism as the view that there is no God. Clearly this is at least coherent. Nope, that's incoherent. How in the name of logic is it incoherent? The burden of proof isn't on me to show that definition is incoherent. The burden of proof is on you to show that definition is coherent. Are you on drugs? Elliot, am I on drugs?
Yeah, definitely.
I knew we shouldn't have eaten that strange burrito I found in the alley. Now, clearly, even if in this particular debate, the atheist has the burden of proof in showing that atheism is true, if I make an objection against atheism, like atheism is incoherent, the burden of proof would be on me to justify that objection. I can't just say any belief I don't want to believe in is incoherent and then run away, so to speak, never giving an argument for my position. In the Q&A section, Candorman was again asked to justify his position, and this was his response.
Candor, what's the best argument you're aware of for non-cognitivism?
Just ask people to explain what it means for something to, for an action to be done just for the sake of doing. Well, ask them to explain or answer the question, what does it mean when you say something should be done without any context or standard to compare it to?
A big problem with that response is that, as Capturing Christianity has pointed out in a video I'll link to below, is that questions are not arguments. I even got the t-shirt. Now, an atheist might give the impression that a question is an argument, but it's important to remember that questions aren't arguments. Now, a question could conceivably lead to an argument, but one, there needs to be a process to arrive at that argument, and two, there actually needs to be an argument there. Merely asking the question isn't going to cut it. And if Candorman did ask the question, what would happen? What does it mean to say something should be done? That one prescriptively ought to do it. And a prescriptive ought is that type of ought that prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive. Like when someone says you shouldn't torture infants. That's incoherent. What's your argument for that? And we're back at square one. We still don't have an actual argument. Part 3. Mind reading. In the debate, Candorman was oddly resistant to the idea that he and I have differing intuitive perceptions about whether morality exists. So how does he get around the apparent obvious of the fact that we do have such different intuitive perceptions? Well, watch this clip. It almost seems like we would have to have this different intuitions, because to you, you don't even see it as a coherent concept. You can't even understand prescriptive oughtness as anything meaningful.
Okay, so
we'd have to have different intuitive perceptions, right?
No, so I think we have the same intuition. So like if I see somebody being murdered, I intuitively know that that's wrong, and I can, think back, okay, why is my intuition telling me this? And I appeal to how that thing hurts human well-being or freedom. When you do the same, instead of you appealing to human well-being or freedom, you may do that, but you go back another step and say it's also because moral or prescriptive morality is true or exists.
Well, no, when you say you intuitively know that it's wrong, you don't mean wrong in the sense that I mean it, because so you don't intuitively know that it's wrong in the sense that I do.
Yeah.
But that would mean then that you and I have different intuitions, because ever since I grew up as a child and my parents taught me on their knee saying, okay, certain things are right and wrong. How did I understand what they meant? Well, I assumed that they talked about prescriptive oughtness, but it came to deontic moral facts. Now, I was not an analytic philosopher by this point, so I didn't have the terminology used to describe it in the way that I just described it to you. but that's how I understood them to mean. And it just seemed true to me growing up that there are certain things that people prescriptively ought not to do. This was immediate to my consciousness. Now, if you don't have that perception, then it would mean that you and I have different intuitive perceptions with respect to this particular issue.
Well, it's sorry, did I cut you off?
No, go ahead.
I feel like it's like, I don't know, it'd be like looking at a red ball, and we both intuitively, I don't know if that's a good example. I'll just keep going with it. But we both see a red ball. We intuitively know that it's red. And you're saying the thing that you're intuiting is that it's painted with I don't know, some type of gouache. I don't know. It's painted with a specific thing, and you're not actually providing evidence. So like we're both experiencing the same phenomenon and the feelings associated with that phenomenon, and you're appealing to something that doesn't make sense to me. And I think it doesn't make sense. I think you're against the idea that it doesn't make sense, so much so that it has to make sense. Like atheism has to be false, because for you to accept that it doesn't make sense to for it to just be true or just be immoral or moral or whatever, would be, it would be something you couldn't handle.
In psychology, there's a cognitive distortion known as mind reading, where one arrives at a belief about a person's thoughts based on insufficient evidence. For example, if you believe Candorman is correct about why I believe in morality, but you can't think of a good argument for that position, you might suffer from this cognitive distortion. Or, if you think you do have an argument, but that argument relies on stereotypes and prejudices, you might be suffering from this cognitive distortion. And now, Candorman, of course, is not correct. That's not how I came to believe in morality. It's not really why I believe in morality.
No, that is not correct. I know what you really think.
You're engaging in the mind-reading fallacy, aren't you?
No, I have an excellent argument for my position.
Does your argument depend upon stereotypes and prejudices of religious folks?
Well, how do you know it's not some secret subconscious thing?
Well, initially, I didn't believe that morality required God at all. For many years, I thought that morality could exist without God, which, incidentally, is something a lot of atheists also believe. Part 4. Denying the first premise. Modifying the first premise to Candorman's moral non-cognitivism, we get this. If God does not exist, it is untrue that moral wrongness exists. Candorman agreed with me that given that God does not exist, it is probably untrue that moral wrongness exists, which logic dictates he should accept the first premise is probably true due to that theorem of math and logic I mentioned earlier. However, humans do not always do what logic dictates, and Candorman rejected the first premise anyway. Now, maybe he just didn't believe me when I told him about that theorem of math and logic, but rather than going through the theorem's proof, which would have been a bit lengthy and probably wouldn't be able to follow anyway, I just went straight to the material conditional, also known as material implication, to explain why he should accept the first premise. In symbolic logic, if P then Q can be symbolized as follows. P, an arrow, and then a Q. The P part is called an antecedent, and the Q part is called the consequent. Sometimes it's read as P implies Q. An alternate symbol for the material conditional uses a horseshoe type thingy. The truth of a material conditional is determined entirely by the truth values of the antecedent and the consequent as follows. If P is true and Q is false, then the material conditional is false. Otherwise, the material conditional is true. For example, if P is true and Q is true, then the material conditional is true. The material conditional might seem like a weak claim in the sense of not claiming very much. After all, the antecedent and consequent don't have to be related to each other at all for the material conditional to be true. And yet, the material conditional is actually good enough for these rules of logic to be valid, meaning that it's impossible to have true premises and a false conclusion. Modus ponens is if P then Q. P, therefore Q. Modus tollens is if P then Q. Not Q, meaning Q is false, therefore not P. Even when just using material conditionals, modus ponens and modus tollens are guaranteed to give true conclusions when given true premises. Go ahead and try it for yourself. Try to have true premises and a false conclusion when using the material conditional in these rules of logic. If the antecedent and the consequent don't have to be related to each other at all, how can one justify a material conditional to be true? It's simple. Given P, probably Q entails probably if P then Q. In the debate, P is God doesn't exist, and Q is it is untrue that moral wrongness exists. I tried explaining to Candorman what the material conditional was, but didn't quite have that much luck. Here are some clips.
So P is if God doesn't exist.
P is God does not exist.
P is God doesn't exist. Q is
It's untrue that some things are morally wrong.
it's untrue that some things are morally wrong. If God does not exist, then it is untrue that things are morally wrong. So if God does not exist, it is untrue that things are. I don't know. I'm having the hardest time grasping this. Okay, so
That's
I
how
disagree with that premise.
Well, you agree with the consequent, though, right? You agree with Q?
I agree with Q.
Okay, but now notice this truth table here.
Mhm.
So here is one possibility. Well, then the material implication is true, right? If P is true and Q is true, then the material implication is true, right?
So I see the table, right? So I think P is false, and actually,
All right, well, if P is false and Q is true, then the material conditional is true.
there's got to be something I'm missing because I have no idea.
As long as Q is true, then this material implication is true. Is that right?
According to that chart, yes.
Yes.
But I believe that either I'm misunderstanding something completely, or that you aren't accurate in your description of how this chart works.
So even when Candorman did eventually understand what I was saying, he still didn't believe me, which might seem egregiously stubborn, but we have to remember that presumably Candorman was not presumably trained in logic. For some crazy reason, formal logic is not part of a standard K-12 education. One of my favorite lines in this book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was when the professor says, "Why don't they teach logic at these schools?" I'm like, yeah, why don't they? My work in apologetics would be that much easier if everybody learned logic. Do you agree with me that logic should be part of standard K-12 education? Comment down below. I'm curious what you think. But yeah, I guess this will about wrap it up. This is Maverick Christian, inviting you to go in peace, serve the Lord, and love logic. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit subscribe and ring the bell.